Welcome, everybody, to Kremlin File. Today, we've got an absolute fabulous guest, Joe Cirincione. Now, he is a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And he also served as president of Ploughshares Fund, and that's a foundation that focused on nuclear nonproliferation and conflict resolution. I think this is really important right now because, right, the big question that all of us have are about nuclear weapons and, you know, the threat of that. So I'm glad that, you know, he was able to find time, right, to come and talk with us.
Absolutely.
Also because he served as director for nonproliferation as well at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he served as security advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's written books. One of them is called Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late. And we are welcoming Joe Cirincione. Joe, I'm pronouncing your name
that
in
is
Italian.
Beautiful. That's exactly right. Giuseppe Cirincione. That's,
oh my God, there you go.
That was my grandfather's name from Sicily.
Really?
That is how you would say the name. But
Sicilian. So we have super intelligence with us today, because you need to know that Sicilians have a reputation of being extremely intelligent. Okay?
As we all know from watching The Princess Bride.
There you go.
Never go up against a Sicilian when death is on the line.
Exactly. Exactly. So today, actually, Joe, we're really happy that you came along, because one of the big questions that we are getting constantly, everywhere I go, as soon as they say, oh, you know, Monique, you know, what's going on, you know, Russia, Ukraine, and so on and so forth, they want to know about nukes. Mm-hmm. Okay, they want to know about nuclear weapons. They want to know about the threats, so on and so forth. But I don't think we should, I think perhaps it's best to start off a bit basic, and then let's move, okay, onto more in depth, okay, as we go forward. So the very first thing is that in the reading, a lot of people don't know the difference. They read it in newspapers, they see it on the news, and they hear terms like strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. Joe, what's the difference between one and the other?
Yeah, it's largely range. It's where you're going to use the weapon. It's not the size of the weapon, because what you could call a tactical nuclear weapon could have the same yield, the same explosive force as the same warhead you'd put on a long-range missile that could span the oceans. What we mean by tactical are weapons that are going to be used in the battlefield or in a particular region. So in the days when I started in national security in Washington in the 1980s, we were worried about a Warsaw Pact invasion, the Soviet Union invading West Germany, and we feared that we couldn't stop that armored tank assault. And so we'd need tactical nuclear weapons that we could fire from artillery pieces. Colin Powell, for example, used to head up an atomic artillery brigade, or short-range bombs that would be dropped from short-range fighters or short-range rockets. So something that would travel hundreds of miles, not thousands of miles. And the explosive force can vary. For example, the Russian weapons that we might be concerned he'd be using, the ones that could fit on the cruise missiles that he's already been firing, or the Iskander short-range ballistic missiles that he's already been firing, those can be fitted with a nuclear warhead. And the yield would range from 10 kilotons, 10,000 tons of explosive force, to over 110 kilotons. By comparison, the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. Wow. So we're talking about something that's the size of a Hiroshima bomb, or perhaps as much as 10 times larger.
Wow. Okay.
And then just to finish this out, the strategic nuclear weapons can be the same size. Yeah. For example, we have on some of our strategic weapons are about 150 kilotons, but we and the Russians go up to 500 kilotons, even a megaton, 1 million tons of TNT. And those are the weapons we put on long-range missiles and bombers that can span the oceans.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Joe, did you hear today, I think there was news that they had, right, Olga, that they had tested a nuclear weapon today.
Not a weapon.
or they didn't. Yeah, what was that?
It was in
What was that?
testing
it was in Kaliningrad, right?
Exactly.
So ever since Putin has taken office back in 1999, 2000, he's been combining any conventional military exercises with nuclear exercises. He's been doing this for some time, and he's increased the tempo. So all major Russian exercises where they're testing out the things that you're seeing them do in Ukraine now, they've coupled that with tests of nuclear capable systems. So right before the invasion of Ukraine, for example, when he was doing what he called military exercises on the border, he tested 6 different nuclear capable systems: planes, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, not with warheads, just the delivery vehicles, just to test the range. And that's what he did in Kaliningrad, I guess yesterday. Testing it, and he's doing it on purpose. So while it's a test of, how would you use a nuclear weapon in a conventional war scenario, he's also clearly sending yet another nuclear signal: back off, don't mess with me, I could go nuclear.
Yeah,
which is what they've been doing. So I follow
and with the propaganda, right? With all the propaganda.
Yep. So I follow Russian media and I follow their propaganda, and I can tell you, they started discussing nuclear weapons in December. And in December, they were using fear-mongering tactics, scaring, attempting to scare, it didn't scare Russians, but attempting to scare Russians that they can, that US and NATO were preparing a nuclear strike on Russia, on Russian soil. So they carried on, and then we saw the shift of propaganda, and there are several messages being sent. One are the threats to the West that are designed to the West, with like today, the testing of delivery vehicles of nuclear weapons, and also telling the West that we're reminding the West that they have nuclear weapons. And then at home they have the fear mongering of that they're in danger, their national security is in danger. And then there was another messaging that has been building up since February, which is them discussing Nazis, Ukrainian Nazis, what they call, and nationalist and Ukrainian military and Ukrainian intelligence services rigging a nuclear plant inside, and that they have intelligence that they have been preparing this in the Kharkiv nuclear facility, that they're doing it in Zaporizhia and Chernobyl. How serious do you take the threat? And out of all the scenarios, do you see Russia pulling off one of them where they even, rigged something inside of Ukraine and then blame Ukrainians for it? And what would the response be from that?
Okay, let's start with what the basis is for the Russian claim that they're being threatened by Ukraine and nuclear capabilities in Ukraine. This is complete nonsense. It's not the first time you've seen a dictator, an authoritarian, claim that their military action was necessary because they were under attack. Remember, Hitler started World War II by claiming that Poland was about to attack or had attacked Germany. We see a similar kind of dynamic here. On the nuclear in particular, it's true that Ukraine used to have nuclear weapons. When Ukraine was the Ukrainian Federation, part of the Soviet Union, and it had stationed on its soil about 1,000, I think 1,700 nuclear weapons that were Soviet weapons under central Soviet control. So when the Soviet Union broke up at the end of 1991, Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan had these weapons on their territory, and they were convinced to give them up. It didn't take much of a job to convince them because they didn't actually control them. They didn't know how to run them. They weren't their weapons. They didn't have the technical capability of maintaining them. They didn't have the budget to maintain them. And so they quickly gave up those weapons in exchange for security assurances from the West and from Russia, and in tighter integration with Europe. Can they get those weapons back? No. Those weapons no longer exist. They were taken to Russia and disassembled. Can they build new ones? Absolutely not. Ukraine has no capability of building nuclear weapons. That is, they don't have the ability to enrich uranium, nope, which is the core of a bomb, like a Hiroshima bomb. And they don't have the ability to make plutonium, which is another material used in the Nagasaki bomb, for example. No, they can't make either one of those things. And even if they could, they don't have the capability to make them into weapons. They don't have the ability to mate them with delivery vehicles like long-range missiles. So no, there is no nuclear threat from Ukraine. Could Russia stage some kind of nuclear incident? We were afraid of this when they seized Chernobyl, because a lot of us thought, why are you doing that? Why are you taking over a nuclear waste site? Well, one fear was that they were going to use some of the highly radioactive materials, not for an explosive device. There was no material you could make a bomb out of there, but for a radiological device to mix some of that highly radioactive material with a conventional explosion and radiate large areas of a downtown area, for example. They actually did seem to have stolen some highly radioactive isotopes from Chernobyl when they left, but they didn't trigger anything there. They didn't stage any kind of accident. They still have the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant under their control, and there are 5, I think, maybe 4 nuclear reactors there, and that's a concern. They still might stage something, intentionally cause a meltdown, cause a leak. So you're worried about that. I wouldn't be worried about a nuclear explosion. I'd be more worried about some kind of radiological event.
Okay. Joe, what you were talking about before, just so that, to circle back for just a second, is that the dirty bomb? Is that when they say the dirty bomb, is that what they're talking about?
Yes. We call it, a radiological device.
Exactly.
But that's a dirty bomb. And it can range from a terrorist type bomb, which is like a small amount of something like cesium-137, and you'd mix it with, say, 10 pounds of dynamite, and you'd spray radioactive dust over an area. It wouldn't kill anybody, but it would, if you ingested it, it would give you cancer, so it would make the area uninhabitable. But you could also go larger. You could be mixing in pounds and pounds of isotopes like this with a much larger explosive and cause some real serious immediate damage, plus making an area uninhabitable for years until you cleaned it up, foot by foot.
Which is now Chernobyl, right? I mean, the soil that's there,
Chernobyl,
right?
It was one of the big problems, still radioactive soil.
Exactly, with the soldiers that were there, the Russian troops that were there, that went back to Belarus, and they were all sick.
Apparently, they were digging trenches in radioactive soil. Never a good idea.
No.
But that just shows you the disrespect, and that's one thing I think the West really needs to understand, is that Putin has absolutely no respect for life, not for his soldiers, not for his people. Right. And, it's always been like that since Soviet days. Okay, so, and what about as far as the nuclear threat now to the West? Do you see Russia crossing that line? Do you, what do you think of all their, the threats they've been making?
The risk of nuclear war is very low. It's highly unlikely. There are formidable barriers to this. I mean, we've been in a lot of international crises over the last 77 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No one has ever used a nuclear weapon. It's what we call the nuclear taboo. All kinds of countries that have them, some democracies, some dictatorships, have never crossed that line for good reason. It's a terrifying line to cross. It would be condemned internationally around the world, and you don't know what's going to happen next. And what's going to be the response of your adversary, especially if it's a nuclear armed adversary, to using something like this. However, in the last 10 or 15 years, once again, we have increased talk about using nuclear weapons at a low level, finding a small nuclear weapon. So by today's standards, small is Hiroshima size, 15 kilotons, or smaller, 10, 5, even 1 kiloton. Now, any of those explosives, even at the lowest possible level, would still be many times more powerful than any conventional weapon we have.
Yeah.
And you're still creating intense heat that would set off mega firestorms. And of course, you have the radiation. So this is it's not like using a conventional weapon. There was a clear difference between the two, and any use by Putin would be met with horror and condemnation, but he still might do it. And here's this different scenarios. Do you mind if I walk through these?
Oh no, that's exactly what we want you to talk about.
That's
because a lot of
we
people
have a question on that.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Because a lot of people think, okay, well, the first they're going to nuke, and then that's it. It's nuclear war. You know what I mean? It's
right.
thermal, huge, like that film or whatever. When that little
the
kid,
day after.
Yeah, exactly. No,
exactly.
Could you explain?
Well,
could you explain to us? Yeah.
Right. So here's think of it as maybe 5 different scenarios, and you can be sure, by the way, that the White House and the Pentagon is working through these scenarios in detail, and they probably have 35 different scenarios, but because there's and you game these things out, and this is what they do all the time. So the thinking has been in American and Russian circles that we have these weapons, but they're too big. We're self-deterred from using them. So why don't we make them smaller, and then we could use them for a particular purpose, and we'd be crossing the nuclear threshold, but we wouldn't be crossing it much, and maybe we could get away with it. And so the U.S. has been talking about this, and under Trump, we have fielded 2 different low-yield weapons that are designed to be small. We fitted one on our it's called the W-76/2 warhead. We put it on a strategic submarine on one of our big missiles that can fly thousands of miles. But instead of carrying the normal 450 kiloton warhead, it's carrying a 5 kiloton warhead. So 1/3 Hiroshima size. And the idea is you would use this first in a conflict. Even if the other guy hadn't fired a nuke, we would do it. So we have this philosophy, right? And so, and Russia does too. So the idea is if Putin starts to, or I would say if Putin starts to continue losing this war, he might feel desperate enough he has to do something dramatic to break the momentum and to change the dynamics on the battlefield. And under Russian strategy, or Russian writings anyway, it's unclear whether this is actually formally part of Russian doctrine. They have something called Escalate to De-Escalate, and it's designed for precisely this scenario. If Russia is losing a conventional war with the West, it would fire off a nuclear weapon to signal the seriousness of the situation and to cause the West to back off. And the scenarios that are described for this involve, 1, a demonstration shot. So fire a nuclear weapon over the Black Sea, for example, just to get their attention. Right. In fact, before we attacked Hiroshima, some of the scientists in the Manhattan Project had urged exactly this kind of thing for Japan. They said, don't use this horrible weapon on people, just do a demonstration of it. Our military rejected that because they wanted the shock effect of a city. And I would suspect that Putin would too. A demonstration shot wouldn't serve his purpose, although it would immediately, the whole world would stop. If you did this, the whole world would stop and go, whoa, what just happened here? Okay? Yeah. So scenario number 2, I think, is more likely that he uses it on a Ukrainian military target. So he takes a relatively small nuclear weapon. As I say, some of the ones that can be fitted on a cruise missile are about 10,000 tons of explosive force, or the equivalent of about 20,000 of our regular conventional bombs. Our bombs tend to be about 1,000 pounds. So imagine 20,000 of those dropping all at once on a military target. Devastation, destruction, hundreds or thousands of people die, but you're not blowing up a city. And perhaps it's fairly isolated. But it signals your purpose. It shows your intent. What do you do? What does NATO do in that regard? The third possibility is that he does it and he fires it on a Ukrainian city, that he takes out Kyiv. Again, maybe Hiroshima size or so, and he takes it out. That's a major step up. Again, the world would stop, complete shock, and you'd have to decide what to do. The fourth possibility is that and this is discussed in the doctrine, is you fire it on a NATO target. Let's say a staging area in Poland where they're transiting and assembling some of the arms. We're now transiting to Ukraine, and he just takes that out. And the fifth possibility is that he fires it at the United States. Again, this is discussed in this Escalate to De-Escalate doctrine, and he takes out a U.S. City or port with this. In that latter case, that is clearly the beginning of a nuclear war. There's no question in my mind that the U.S. military would want to respond with a nuclear weapon, right? That's it. We would go right after them. And then you're off to the races because nobody knows what happens
Nobody
next.
knows what happens
right?
after that.
Right.
Right.
But on the other cases, even hitting Poland, there's the U.S. conventional and NATO conventional forces are so powerful, are so precise that you don't really need to use a nuclear weapon in response. For example, the U.S. could once just send in NATO air and ground forces, and you'd really enter the war right away, and you would devastate Russian forces on the ground within days, certainly weeks.
Yeah.
It'd be over. The war would be over. You could also decide to selectively strike, so not do that, but strike at the site that or the base that launched this attack. So if a base in Russia had launched a cruise missile that had taken out a Ukrainian military site, you could immediately direct precision fire, conventional, on that base and destroy it with dozens or hundreds of cruise missiles, etc. And you might even start going after the command and control system in Russia with cyber attacks or with conventional attacks to try to knock out his ability to launch any more weapons. All of this is very risky, and I'm just giving you a crude outline of the kinds of responses you might expect from the West. All of these have great risks because you don't know what Putin does next. And that's why you want to prevent this scenario from unfolding in the first place, because every step after the use of a nuclear weapon is much more dangerous than anything that preceded it.
Wow. Whoa, this is sobering. This is absolutely sobering. But it's good to know these different, that it's not the actual first response, right? This is extremely important to understand. And there's probably, Joe, how many scenarios are there? You mapped out 5, but there's probably what? How many other scenarios are they thinking of?
Right. Oh, and then gradations of this. There's all kinds of things you can imagine using. So, for example, I gave you the idea of using a nuclear weapon on an Ukrainian military target. And I said, maybe it's a low yield weapon. Well, maybe it's a large yield weapon. That's another scenario on this. Maybe they don't, maybe they claim credit for it. Maybe they don't claim credit for it. And maybe they insist that this is the secret nuclear Ukrainian cabal. Right. And that they blew themselves up. And so that's what every one of these starts to have variations on it. And there's ones that I haven't thought of that I'm sure the White House is thinking of.
Of course. Actually, I want to circle back for just a second because you mentioned NATO and NATO forces. And I was reading about that, the UK and also France have nuclear weapons as well. Are they in this scenario as well, or are they?
We don't
not really.
They could be, and Boris Johnson would answer yes to this scenario. And in fact, just over the weekend, there was a Russian Olga. Maybe you saw this. There was a Russian newscaster who aired on the equivalent of Russia's 60 Minutes show. Aired an animation of a Russian nuclear attack on United Kingdom. Trying to react to Boris Yeltsin's speech to the Ukrainian parliament, trying to push him back. So UK is in the mix, France is in the mix, but it's highly unlikely either one of those countries would use a nuclear weapon without checking with the United States. On this level, I think the United States is calling the shots.
Okay.
Interesting. They've been over the years. You know how many times I've watched their animations over the years of striking like Nevada. Like even just in the empty field, I think there's something in Nevada that they're very interested in because every simulation they have, it's like, oh, we're not going to kill anyone, but we're going to strike this target in Nevada. And they show like a simulation of a nuclear missile flying to U.S. And I mean, this is like,
or Florida.
Know, the past decade then.
Florida.
Florida.
Florida. We got to say Florida.
Mar-a-Lago.
They showed one when they unveiled some of their weapons back in, I can't remember, 2017. they showed a nuclear missile heading into Mar-a-Lago.
I remember.
Oh, really?
They were angry. Yeah, they were
Poor
angry at
Iguanas.
Trump for
Yeah.
something that
Oh,
he
okay.
didn't do, and
And
they
that's
were
it.
ranting all weekend. And then the next
That's
thing was
it.
suddenly like this
Right.
simulation of a
Right. So
nuclear weapon.
the question that's being debated on this is how seriously do you take this? And right now there are sort of like three camps.
Yeah.
And one is this is all bluff. We shouldn't be intimidated by this, because the problem you have right now is that these weapons that we've been trained and we grew up with as been told protect us and are the power that underline everything else the U.S. does militarily and will allow us to confront aggression and coercion around the world, are actually being used as a nuclear shield by Putin to stop us from confronting his aggression. I mean, that's why NATO is not more deeply involved. It's this risk,
Yeah.
right? So you have this. So there are some people who are saying, don't be deterred by that. It's all a bluff. We should go in with ground troops now. We should go in with airstrikes now. The other side says the risk is so great, you have to take this very seriously, that you shouldn't even be arming Ukraine with artillery, with howitzers, with heavy combat equipment now. It's too risky, back out. And the third side, I guess, that's where I put myself, is like, we have to take this seriously, but you can calibrate your response the way Joe Biden is. So what you're doing is giving Ukraine the weapons they need, but you're not doing it in a way that's so provocative that you push Putin against the wall and you cause him to lash out by something as crazy as using a nuclear weapon. I got to give the administration high marks for how they've been handling this. They've been strong, they've been resolute, but they've been careful. They have not been reckless. They have not been provocative. They haven't matched any of Putin's nuclear threats with threats of our own.
Yeah.
No.
Actually, I did want to
Not
ask you about that. But before I do, about Biden's leadership, okay, so to maybe get a little more into that, I wanted to ask, this is a silly question, okay, but I get it all the time. Like, okay, Putin just decides, all right, we're going to use a nuclear weapon. Is he the only one pressing the button? Like, how does that happen exactly on the Russian side?
It's unclear exactly,
Really?
but whereas in the United States, only the president of the United States has the ability to launch the weapon, and he's followed around 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by an officer carrying the nuclear football, the briefcase, with the communication codes and the nuclear war options that would allow him to do this. And if he wanted to do it, the president of the United States could launch a nuclear weapon within about 5 minutes of deciding to do so. It would take 5 minutes to get on the phone, to reach the commanding general, and to launch a weapon, and no one could stop him. So he has sole and unfettered authority to launch nuclear weapons, doesn't need the approval of anybody else. In Russia, we believe that there are 3 people who have the nuclear football.
Okay.
So it's Putin, it's the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, and it's the Chief of Staff of the General Forces, Gerasimov, currently. And each one of them has a nuclear football. And we believe the system is set up so that all 3 of them have to agree before you would use it. But it's a little unclear. We don't know what's happened in recent years with Putin and whether he's overridden this system or not. Regardless, I think the 2 of them are so under his control that it's highly unlikely that they would disagree with the Putin decision to launch. If they did, they'd be fired and replaced by someone who would agree.
Yeah, or a
but
window.
That's the system.
Or a window. They just sort of fall out of it.
So the system in Russia basically is actually safer than the United States system, but with an autocrat, nothing's safe. It's still concentrated power for people to launch weapons that could end the world with no debate, no discussion, no involvement of anybody else.
Okay.
I was chuckling because, following their media, social media, and chatter from inside, I think Shoigu has already been put under house arrest a few times, had a heart attack. Then there were rumors he died. Then he
didn't look too good the other day.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
He didn't look good.
And there's so much chatter around him. And then Gerasimov, Putin is so furious with him that you saw. I mean, I've never in my life imagined, but for humiliation purposes, send him literally to Izium, to command the local,
The battalion.
strikes.
Yeah, the strike.
And then there were reports that he got injured, and same thing. I mean,
Right.
there's so much like swirling things. So I'm like, my goodness, those two, Putin will knock them over the head and take their nuclear
Yeah, exactly.
footballs.
Yeah.
Here, have some tea.
Yeah.
Have a drink of tea,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
hey, have a seat, have some tea. I'll pour you some.
Yeah.
That's basically.
So,
it.
what worries me now is all the chatter on the Russian media and in the policy statements. They're starting to make nuclear use sound acceptable, right?
Exactly. They're normalizing
and this
it.
is what's
like it's
changed.
Something, yeah.
Yeah, like we're going to do this. We can do this. It would be a good thing if we did this.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid of it. This would be a sign of Russian strength if we did this. So you're always worried about this kind of propaganda, paving the way for an act that they might even not actually be contemplating doing, but in a moment of crisis, it could be seen even to the decision makers more acceptable because you've been talking about it for so long.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what they've been doing.
Yeah.
And they actually started this because they've been planning this invasion on Ukraine for years, because they invaded in 2014, but they've been laying the groundwork. First, they wanted to capture Belarus and then move on. And in, I think it was 2018 or 19 that Putin signed a decree allowing for a nuclear response in a conventional and usage.
Yes, that's right. They changed their doctrine.
Weapon.
That's right. They used to have something we call no first use policy. So that is, they promise not to use a nuclear weapon first, and they changed that to basically to correspond to the U.S. position. We reserve the right to use a nuclear weapon first, even though we have the best military in the world. We still reserve the right to use a nuclear weapon if we believe that our security requires it. That's the doctrine.
Wow.
If there's a serious threat to the nation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they added it. And I mean, their serious threat could be, Belarus. It could be Ukraine that they claim is theirs. It could be anything.
Or it could be
not even Russian territory.
Exactly. If the state is threatened, well, what's the state? If the national security interests of Russia are threatened, well, what's that? And for somebody like Putin, who is l'État et moi, the state is me.
Yeah.
If he feels threatened.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's true. It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he feels he's the state. That's it.
Yeah.
So if he's under threat, personal threat, it could be something. Yikes. Well, thank goodness Biden is in the White House.
Exactly.
Right? Thank goodness.
Yes.
No, yes.
Yes.
Can you imagine what this would be like if Trump was still the president, and what the reaction would be, how disunited the West would be, would put, etc. Or if there was somebody less capable. I mean, one of Biden's benefits is that he's been dealing with these issues for almost 50 years.
Right.
So he in some ways is the perfect president for this moment. He gets it, he understands it, and he's assembled a team around him that has handled it. I gotta say, about as well as you could expect under the circumstances, carefully, methodically, forcefully. And continuing to advance, so that, for example, we're now sending heavy weapons to Ukraine. These artillery pieces, armored personnel vehicles, artillery rounds. We can talk about that later if you want. But this is something he didn't do in the beginning of the war because he thought it'd be too provocative. He, waited until we found, no, I think I can do this without provoking Putin, and so far he's right.
Okay, so in steps, basically, this is what we've been seeing.
Yeah,
stepping away from the nuclear, there has been a lot, and I actually just wrote about it for SIPA. There has been a lot of not only propaganda, it literally is the same identical playbook of what was used with Ukraine, except it took a few months with Ukraine, right before Putin launched a war, with Moldova, with Transnistria. And here it's like being done in such an escalated time that what took them to lay out, these false flag operations and the propaganda behind it is now taking 2 weeks. And it went from, literally them saying the Russian government saying they need to protect the Russian speakers, to then suddenly calling President Sandu a Nazi and they have to step in to uproot Nazism. And then Igor Strelkov, who was behind one of the key people behind the annexation of Crimea, came out with a very bizarre but troubling insider information, which is a lie, that Romania had sent troops inside to Moldova,
Sure.
and that there's a warehouse with Moldovan militaries, and the Romanian military is going to put on and fight under Moldovan militaries to start a war. This is all a lie. But then right after that, we saw suddenly a series of attacks, and they're just continuing every few days. What is your assessment of that? And what do you think? And how do you see, do you see Putin trying to maybe test with Moldova and then expand it to NATO? Or do you think he would just keep it in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, you've explained this beautifully. And in the national security circles in the West, there's increasing concern about this kind of what we call horizontal escalation. So, instead of just escalating on the battlefield and the battle you're fighting against Ukrainian forces in the Donbass region, you open up another front. And you move it there. And yes, I think you have to be worried about this. And the signs are troubling, the ones you just detailed, as well as statements last week by a leading Russian general that said that the war aim was to take over all of the southern coast of Ukraine. So all of that, the coastline across the Black Sea, all the way through Odessa and linking up with Moldova. Well, there you are. So we have those, 1,500 Russian forces, 8,000, I forget how many are in the area they call Transnistria.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you got to be worried about places, you never heard of. And part of this gets to the issue of why is Putin doing any of this to begin with? And one of the reasons is to take over Ukraine's resources, including its grain. And the grain fields of Ukraine so far have been relatively untouched. That is, farmers are planting the grain and planning on harvesting it. But when they come to sell it, well, now they need the ports on the southern coast.
Right.
So Kherson, which the Russians have captured or are trying to capture, mostly captured, is a grain port. Mariupol is a grain port. Odessa is a grain port. They've got the one, they've almost gotten Mariupol the second, and they may have designs on Odessa. You take those over, and you basically then control Ukraine's crop, which has enormous implications, both on food supply, on the economy of Ukraine. And this appears to be what, at least one of Putin's aims in going in there in the first place. As Zbigniew Brzezinski said, that without Ukraine, Russia cannot be an empire, and with Ukraine, Russia is automatically an empire. It is that land that gives Russia this kind of global capability that it doesn't have without it. And it's why in this region of the world, there have been over 11 wars fought on this territory in the last 250 years, going back to the Crimean Wars, the Russo-Turkish Wars. It's why Catherine the Great sent her army across Ukraine and founded Odessa in the first place. It's all about controlling that farmland and that enormous grain output. And so that's a big part of what's going on here that we're not aware of really as much as we should be when examining Putin's motives for starting this war in the first place.
Well, because a lot of people don't study, right?
That's what Stalin did.
Well,
That's what Stalin did.
Stalin's gold, right? That's what they called
That's what Stalin
the
did.
wheat and the grain. They called, didn't they? They called it Stalin's gold.
Stalin's gold, and the war against the what he called the rich peasants, the kulaks, the massacre of some 4 million of those during the Stalin purges.
Exactly.
Exactly.
No.
It was all over this control of the grain.
And what people don't understand, what we're seeing now, this military strategy came out in 2009, and it was something internal that happened. One of the key people inside of Ukraine, who was former KGB colonel, and he kind of got pushed outside from power. Anyway, it was a domestic issue, but Russia got worried enough that they designed this military strategy. Their military strategy was to take all of Odessa, Mariupol, Melitopol, Kherson, cut Ukraine off, Kharkiv, cut Ukraine off from the port, take the east, take the south, and then have access, expand their access to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. So this is what was there. On top of their military strategy, with Ukraine, which then, went into effect after they lost Yanukovych and he fled to Russia. That's what triggered this. And this is what they actually attempted to do. They tried to take Odessa. They tried to take these cities, Kharkiv, in 2014. But on top of their other military strategies, the expansion of, they have been forever talking about taking the Suwalki corridor so they could connect Kaliningrad to Suwalki corridor, take Belarus, and then take the Baltics, and then take Ukraine, and then Moldova. And this is something, regardless of who the president is in the United States, what the policies are, whether we have a reset, we don't have a reset, this is what their military strategy is, and they're quietly going about it, because Belarus was softly annexed, and once they had Belarus, they expanded their military field and then can move on to Ukraine. So, and when I saw these arguments here, I was like, what? Or blaming Biden. I'm like, what does Biden have to do with something that was like put into effect like over a decade ago? They put this.
Let me strongly agree with you. And this is not a defensive war.
No.
This is, and especially now where the strategy seems to have shifted from just to a scorched earth policy. He is just spreading wanton destruction, and there's no other word for it. This is a fascist ideology, where you were just obliterating cities. You're rounding up and executing people. You're raping women and girls. You're killing any man who might serve in the military services. You're tearing down Ukrainian flags. You're re-educating school children to learn Russian and to consider themselves Russian. This is at least cultural genocide that's going on right now, and I don't believe he will stop with Ukraine. So you've got to stop this right now. And in the process, you can develop policies. My friend Matt Duss has a wonderful article in Foreign Affairs right now talking about how you can improve policies to stop Putin by having more progressive elements to your foreign policy, your policy now. For example, we want to deny Putin the money from sale of oil. Well, let's accelerate our transition and Europe's transition to a green economy. And you, Monique, probably hear these debates. It's not just not buying Russian oil and buying Saudi oil. Let's not buy oil. Let's move it along, right? And you're solving two problems at once. You're reducing reliance on petrostates, especially the autocratic petrostates, and you're saving the planet. And once you start thinking of it that way, you realize there's a whole lot of very good things that can be accomplished in the effort to stop Putin and to reverse his invasion.
Joe, how do you see this thing panning out, let's say in the next little while? What's your assessment on that?
Okay, number one, nobody knows, right? and nobody's known from day one, where we all thought this was going to be over in a couple of weeks, right? So number two, you can start to sketch out scenarios. This could end up being a collapse of the Russian forces. You could see the Russian forces collapse like they did in World War I when the Russian front just collapsed. You could, and a sort of chaotic end of the war effort. You could see this develop into a grinding, sustained war that's more looks like the Saudi war on Yemen, or even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, something that simmers for a long time over years and flares up occasionally in fighting. So these are all different scenarios. Nobody knows. If I was to, I think the best option right now is a slow defeat of Putin. Because you're starting to be concerned, and you see people starting to write about this. While we want to weaken Russia so they can't do this again, you don't want a collapsed Russia. You don't want a collapse of Putinism such that you have the problems you had in 1991, 92, 93, fears of loose nukes, chaos in the economy, perhaps ultra-nationalist, more ultra-nationalist forces rising to seize, because this could get worse. There are people that might be worse than Putin.
Worse than him. Oh dear.
Yeah, so right. So you're starting to see where. So what you want is what is actually, and this is what's sort of encouraging to me right now, is you see the Russian offensive in the Donbass region stalling. They are not making any significant advances. And in some areas, they're being beaten back by the Ukrainian forces. And you see new armaments coming in that are really going to give the Ukrainians an edge. They already have the edge in tactics and morale, you know, and in fighting spirit. I mean, what the Ukrainians are doing is astonishing. With these kind of howitzers that are coming in, these kind of more precision-guided weapons, the kind of intelligence they're getting from the United States and other countries, and their ability to pinpoint target, they're combining, in my world, you're combining intelligence with precision targeting. So you know where the generals are, and you have the weapons that can take out that building, that car, right?
Yeah.
And whether we're talking about drones or precision-guided missiles, or now we have precision-guided artillery shells, which we are shipping to Ukraine as we speak, you could see this thing result in the defeat and the pushback of Russian forces out of the Donbass region, such that Putin sues for peace. Because he's the one that can end this. And he says, okay, let's have a ceasefire, which the Ukrainians have been asking for weeks, a ceasefire and discussions over the status of these disputed areas, which Ukraine has been asking for. And then you can calm the thing down, and you can arrive at an agreement that will probably involve territorial concessions on the part of Ukraine, as difficult as that is, but will result in a stronger Ukraine that's able to resist any further Russian advances in the future.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the bet. And then Putin stays in power, but he's been hobbled.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, because there are people who push for regime change and think, you know, U.S. and the West should do that. That will harden Russians for the next 100 years. I mean, they will despise the West. The best, my personal thing is containment, just like North Korea. Pretend they don't exist, lock them up, lock the country up, don't do business with it. And, you know, and that's it. And cut all the Western, things that attract them. And that's it.
So that's why I support what Secretary...
I can promise you.
That's what Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said. We want to weaken Russia so they can't do this again. Some of my friends went ballistic over that. Oh my God, this is an expansive war aim. Look at what you're doing. No. He didn't say we want to destroy Russia. He didn't say we want to collapse Russia. I think it's the appropriate response. You want to weaken them so they can't do this again. You can do that with export controls, denying them sort of key technology. You can do that by not buying their oil anymore. You can weaken them without collapsing them. I think that is actually the correct goal for the U.S. at this point. No direct U.S. NATO forces, but give the Ukrainians what they need. And they appear to be, this is unbelievable. The Ukrainians appear now to be able to defeat the Russian army, something none of us thought possible 2 months ago. Now it looks likely at this point.
Yeah. Joe, can I ask you maybe one of the last questions? I don't know whether Olga then has another one. What impressed you most about the Ukrainian armed forces? What is it that, let's say, I'm sure that in the 24th, you were probably a little, you know, there are lots of people that were in shock. I don't know whether you were or not, but what has impressed you up to now? Like, what do you say, oh my God, this is great?
I'll give you my answer, and I think a lot of people would say this. It's the small unit initiative. It's the ability of small units of Ukrainians to take on armored tank columns, stop them in their tracks by knocking out the lead tank, and then picking off the rest over time. I mean, this is one of the great stories of the war that will, you know, military historians and logistics
they're going to be
experts are going to be talking about. Because yes, in Donbass right now, we're seeing set piece battles, you know, massed artillery, trench warfare. But in Kyiv, and where they stopped this, it was small groups going into the forested areas. You know, they'd come through a village, they would devastate the village, they'd be moving their tank columns through, they would 5-6 guys, sometimes on ATVs with javelin missiles, would knock out the lead column, call in the coordinates of the entire column. Artillery from the rear would go and then take it out. And it was all made possible by this small group initiative. That's something the Russians don't have. You've seen it. They have a top-down structure that the local troops, the frontline troops, aren't allowed to make decisions. It's the generals that call the shots, which is why you've seen so many generals traveling to the front line, and which is why you've seen so many killed. 12 Russian generals killed right now. Oof. They don't have what the Ukrainians have. And in the process of this, they've demonstrated the ability of small arms, small precision arms, javelins, stingers, to take out, armored units that cost much more than the cost of the javelin missile. 100 to 1 or 20 to 30 to 1 in cost exchange ratio. And a lot of people starting to look at this and going, "Whoa. This is a change in military technology." The defense, because of these new technologies, with these kinds of tactics, now has the advantage over even the most powerful offense. And you're seeing it in the sea battles as well. When you can knock out a Russian cruiser with 2 precision-guided missiles. Right!
It's true!
I go,
it's like, boom!
So I'm telling you, above and beyond everything we've been talking about this level of warfare and what's happening and what the Ukrainians are showing us is sending ripples through the national security communities and what it tells you about what kind of weapons you need and what you can do with what you got.
Yeah. And I think, yes.
And to end it on a lighter note, probably their most popular weapon has become the tractor that has been taking all these disabled tanks.
It's true.
And that's it. And you see them attaching the Russian tank and
it's true. I love
driving it away.
I always go and try whenever I need a moment of levity. I'm not kidding you, because a lot of this stuff is really difficult to get through. And I go on my Twitter feed and I try to find the Ukrainian Tractor Corps, and I just go through and I try to look at all of those, and I love them. And actually, my husband's he knows all about tractors, so he says, "Oh, this is a John Deere. Oh, this is something else, right?" And he knows exactly what it is. He said, "I can't believe these guys," because I can't read it. It's like, man, that's it.
Precision guided tractors. That's great. Well, listen, guys, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Grazie. Thank you
so much.
Prego.
Hey everybody, if you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and please visit our website, kremlinfile.com. This is a Bunker Crew Media production, hosted by Olga Lautman and me, Monique Amara, with executive producers Marley Clements, Jack Bryan, Grant DeSimone, Ben Brett, and Jordy Mycelis of Midas Media, with associate producers Ruby Frankel and Sarah Metz. Theme music by Oreste Camarra. Sound editing and mixing by Joy Ellett. Subscribe to Kremlin File wherever you listen to podcasts.